last week on some of these matters here, and I want you to keep in mind, we haven't said a lot about method, but I have a very important paper on scientific method on reserve. See, that's not another thing from our concern. It's another. I have another class, and I just received a very gracious criticism from the book from the people from University of Wisconsin, and it's exactly what I said. They're very important studies, but they have no philosophy of science judgment in any of the articles. And this was the judgment, you see, of people. And I hope to avoid that by going through the whole history of changing concepts, scientific method, and what I'm trying to do. So people who do nothing but work in that, see, that isn't all that I do. But they do that all the time. They teach that. That's all they research. If you only had to research one subject and you could read and write, you ought to know a whole lot. See, but that is a luxury that very few Christians at this juncture can afford, just to study one thing. But that beats not studying any at all. Now, I want you to look at that article. Loudon's the author. Lauden. But it's on reserve. Now, I just have one copy. I realize if you just had to read that, you couldn't all, go down there and fight and rip pages out of each other's hand. But be aware of the issues of scientific methodology. Because historically we go from epistemology to methodology to hermeneutics. Historically. And the understanding of anything is a hermeneutical matter. Whether that's physics or chemistry or the Bible, that's hermeneutics. Whatever it takes to understand something, language. You okay?
I am, but I don't know about this guy.
You should have stood in bed.
Yeah.
Method. So we need to look at this. Just minimal mention. I'll say a little bit more when we get deeper into our work. But I said, and I want you to watch this as you read, the issue that was sought for is universality. As you read that, you read Cohen's book. Next week we'll start giving the report. And is it this week? Okay, we'll start this week then. It's a week ahead of time. That's supernatural. Universality of the application of method to matter in motion mathematized. Now, without dealing with the nature of mathematics or the nature of numbers, why is it that mathematics just happens to work out to be the language of nature that is beyond ordinary language? I have some papers on the history of mathematics up to Gödel's theorem and some things on reserve for you to look at. We're going to touch this probably one more time, and then we'll turn, just because we have to, we will turn to the application of the scientific method that's established in these perimeters. Here first, here, the little bit of work that we did last week, to produce a mechanical model which in essence was the assertion that you could mathematize matter. That's a reductionism, that reality is nothing but matter in various forms. Well, if that's true, then the Christian position is nonsense. It's not merely ludicrous or mythological, it's stupid. And it's very important, but the whole history of science is demonstrated that's not fair. I believe that in the providence of God. See, if man can't get to it, it's like Eastern Europe. Well, God will get to it. See, he opens doors. The doors may not stay open long, See, they may be open in Mexico, but they won't stay open long because someone will shoot through them. And that's how we're going to be looking at that. I want you to keep in mind as we turn just ever so superficial look at changing views of matter. What is the nature of matter? Now, if all that exists is matter, the whole issue of time, space, I want you to keep concepts alive in your mind. Is time physical? Is space physical? See, the whole history of the development of science has created problems in those parameters. Let me just show you what's here, and we'll touch from the Greeks up through the Middle Ages, up to the classical effort. We'll get to these. Let me bypass this topic here. Not spend a lot of time on these. If you do not know this book, I'd encourage you to look at this book, Bird's Metaphysical Foundation, because it's inexpensive paperback form. Very important. And Strong, I have that in the bibliography, a book published at the University of Southern California, 1937, would be the book to look at because some thought that Strong had responded to Bird. So those two books would have to be dealt with as kind of an interfacing. Now here's the problem by 17th century empiricism. I want you to see what's coming. Locke and Berkeley and Hume made the distinctions, see, after Newton, of primary and secondary qualities in matter. Now keep in mind empiricism, science empirical, science will refute empiricism. Science itself refutes it. So if a hard-headed physicist at the university keeps talking about being an empiricist, he can't possibly operate in the laboratory. Okay? Now, primary and secondary. Primary is what is quantifiable in these things. Secondary is where the relativism comes in. The aesthetics. Whereas the primary is reducible to what science deals with. Now, is it true that it is self-evident that matter is reducible to primary and secondary qualities? Who's ever seen any of them? Well, these are theoretical constructs over the nature of matter that shows up in philosophy. Here's the example of the electron. Now Bill would know that Bill visits, and I'll not talk very much about that because you either have to get in or get out. About the electron, this is the standard equations for the nature of the electron, and this is there's no evidence that contradicts it, but see that in theory formation, do not assume something's true because there's no evidence to the contrary. It may be of such a nature that evidence is precluded by the very thing that you're defining. Watch out for the definitional fallacy. One does not define reality, and then a person says, well, see, show me that that's wrong. Prove to me that this is wrong. Prove to me that your uncle, that wasn't originally a hyena, well, he is now. What do you mean originally? Now, no evidence, so we're talking about mathematical evidence, and if that's meaningless to you, well, that's fine. To some, it won't be meaningless. But look at this whole business of the development of the electron and the experimentation, the relationship of experimentation. See, already the fundamental construct in matter analysis is something that has theoretical import. That's the reason I put that up there. It already has a mathematical, theoretical import that is not in principle. I think, now the last time I did any physics, now Bill, you've been more recently, you always have to be open to whatever. I know of no experiment, see, that's got beyond this. Now it's always possible, and I don't want to say there isn't any, because I haven't technically studied physics for a little while, but Bill, he'll keep us on track now. Now electrons, see, mass or matter will turn into mass. And mass will deteriorate, see. The very nature of matter and mass will become dematerialized. Well, is that just intellectual construction? Is that the nature? And two things. If that's meaningful to you, hop to it. If it isn't, just don't hop to it. Now, these are things I do want to ask you to think about because I'll not come to them again. Now, intrinsically, the non-interacting electron appears to have no structure. That's very important. Whether Peter Berger is even partly correct that all reality is socially constructed. Now, some reality is socially constructed. See, in social structures, whether you eat bananas or whether you eat grapefruit or hamburgers is not a revealed nor universally structured phenomena. Now, look at this. This is Stanford. If you don't do physics, that's meaning don't worry about that. I want you to worry about it, but don't worry about it. This is a Stanford. This is not the standard. Standard equipment. We'll check to see whether this is true in smaller distance. What's all this about? Whether the scientific method operates with assumptions all the way into the very grounding matter, or whether these phenomena are observed. No, they're observed through instruments that have theoretical construction already in them. Point is, we're never able to look at nature directly as it is. It is always inferred. And a second thing, in the structure of reality, there is no available information that I know of that the deeper into matter, as science penetrates, structure is always present. There is never any structureless matter. What difference does that make? Well, the odd thing is how invisible perimeters of reality is already structured, and the mind doesn't structure it, the mind discovers structure. Does that make any difference? Or hopefully we can have a revival on that. Now, a second thing, these would be conclusions we were going through. Atom, break down the atom, electron, meson, quark, all. However, the interaction with the quantifiable electromagnetic field. Now, this is all very important, see, for matter, which laid the electron scattering, pair creation things that only physics students do. Read this. Now, the ultimate thing is that this cannot be extended. See, these are mathematical extrapolations. That's the only reason to put them up here.
Just a minute ago, you said that the structure is there, but our mind isn't created, but rather we discover it. How would we know that?
Well, because it's only by quantification, and all that assumption, you see, is over the assumption of why mathematics actually describes what the human mind cannot quantify. The eyes. See, we're way past any empiricism. See, it's all because you couldn't quantify it, it had no structure. See, even erratic motion, subatomic particles, if there's no structure at all, you could either locate speed, locate it, or do the speed of an electron in microscopic particles. See? And just because the eye or the equipment that we have can't locate it, you can statistically locate. You can statistically locate the speed and the location, but it never stays. It's always, and it sounds like this is Eastern mysticism. It sounds like Hinduism, but we'll try to watch that when we get to it. Now, on a large scale, one may find the uncertainty, we're on the way to the uncertainty principle. Find Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. What's uncertain? Well, the structure is not uncertain because if the universe were totally uncertain, if the chaos principle actually worked, there would be no way it was statistically stated. And what we're saying is that language and thought is limited, but the mind can use mathematics that just seems to fit. And that's odd. Why is that the case? I didn't say I answered that, I just asked a question. Why is it that math is the language of nature in its mobility? So look at these things, and I put this question mark because it's been some time since I've been to a literate school, and we need to find out, and Bill, you'll help us see whether the most recent material here in electron wave packet, whether the present point of view, that may not be the present point of view, I'd have to check that out, and I have no one to ask but you. And all this raises the problem whether ontologically there is such a thing as mental or everything's reducible to physical. See, if there is no mental, there is no spiritual. You don't need to worry about the Holy Spirit. You don't need to worry about inspiration. You don't need to worry about miracle. All of that, if matter is reducible, and all we have are physical components. Any That's why scientists, hard-headed scientists, see, don't understand what Christians talk about when they talk about spiritual. What is that, and how would one get at that? Well, see, this all reduces to whether or not physical is self-explanatory, because the mental always transcends what it is that explains. And we have two ontologies, and that's the mind-body problem. It reduces to, mental, and this, freedom, all this, the nature of man, whether man's genetically and environmentally determined. Physics knows nothing about that. And it's in, you look at those later, but it's in the perimeter. It's only since 1904, see, that the greatest physicist in the world acknowledged what? We said that last time, 1903. Well, they're going to split. They didn't split it in 1903, but they're going to split it, but they can't split it if it doesn't exist. See? It'd be hard to do. If it doesn't exist, it'd be more complex to split. So I want to turn to tracing some incremental, but mainly paradigmatic shift in the nature of matter. In the nature of matter. Over here, I'll show you in Greek, classical Greek, Aristotle's science was based in metaphysics. And metaphysics is the foundation, see, of certainty. And science is a word in classical form. It means absolutely certain knowledge. Well, absolutely certain knowledge is knowledge that asserts that there could not be, on the very nature of the case, any counterfactual evidence. Absolute certainty about anything requires the affirmation that there is no possible counterfactual evidence. Does that make, this late at night? So certainty, we don't have to be atheists or undercut the Bible or our faith, see, to say, hey, be very epistemologically be humble when you talk about certainty. Because you can be certain about things that are wrong. So certainty has a logical, epistemological, and psychological factors. So certainty, I'm not undercutting the faith when I do epistemologically deny that anybody has absolute apodictic certitude about anything. That's not available. That doesn't give me skepticism nor relativism. That just means that the human mind does not have access to that kind of truth claim. Now, watch that, but Greek science was absolutely certain. And it primarily was based in Aristotle's metaphysics. Now, the physicists were Democritus and Heraclitus, but it was Plato and Aristotle that actually won the day, that stabilized the world. But Democritus and Heraclitus set the stage in classical Greek thought for a discussion of the so-called building blocks of reality. See, we just sketched just a tiny bit up to the periodic chart. Well, from that time forward, you will get a reductionism. See, that everything in the universe is composed of various combinations of these building blocks. And anything that's real is composed of one or more of these building blocks. Well, then that means God's not real, or God doesn't exist. That means Holy Spirit is just hogwash. That means any spiritual talk is not. That means ethics is nonsense. That means aesthetics is nonsense. That means God talk long before it was a problem with the linguistic analytic tradition. God talk is out of the question, because you can say anything you want in imaginative literature without assuming that what you're talking about is the case. See, Tolkien created hobbits, but he never believed there were such things. But they made perfectly good sense, though they were not real. Okay? Now, in classical Greek view of matter, this word, element, but this is an abstract term. Atom, our English word comes from the Greek word atom. And I've chosen, rather than to trace the changing view of the atom, to use a broader concept for this matter, but would have to show the history of the changing view of the atom. But the atom is the building block of matter. What is matter? Atoms plus other things. See? What is matter? Does it matter? Now, these things right here, Adam, nature. Now, don't forget that physis in classical Greek thought, and that's where the break will come when we come to the modern period. When you speak of the nature of anything, any classical lexicon, I don't mean biblical lexicons, even the Kittel article on physis, see, would give you in classical Greek. See, physis in classical Greek thought had a minimum 6 senses, 6 meanings, the nature of something. But for our more practical evening revivalistic purposes, this was an abstraction. See, the nature of something is the essence of something. Now, see, empiricism is going to be hard on abstractions. We never see an abstraction. But whether the mind needs abstraction to handle reality is the real point. Not whether we're confused about abstraction and a tree, see? Or a brickbat, or a banana, whatever. So, element, that is Greek, Latin. This is Greek term. This is a Greek term. Nature, natura, is Latin term right here. And principle, this has to do with abstract epistemological. And now this is over motion, these two principal terms. Motion. The Greeks were trying to solve the phenomena of motion and the phenomena of something existing and passing away, see, at a crude level. We're talking about matter in motion, decay, this kind of thing. And Aristotle gave the most reasonable explanation. But from the Greeks up through the medieval Christian inheritance of Greek thought, this is what creates the problem at Galileo forward. That Christian thinkers employed, see, this is the first cross-cultural use. See, eventually, theologians will use Kant, then Hegel, then Heidegger. You see, they'd use Plato and Aristotle before that in the West. And when the East said, well, we don't want Western thought, see, the East cannot be exempt from some thought system either. It's the thought system that explains things that we're after, not just any thought system, East or West. So, Greek medieval inheritance. The church imbibes on this explanatory system. And the church will stand against certain developments in science. When I say the church, I mean both Catholic and Protestant, see, till after, a century after the scientific revolution. And here's what happened. The Ionians sought to explain. Now, they were conscious that they were trying to explain physical change. Now, see how that is grounded in common sense realism. Change. People are born and people die. See, just commonsensically, that gave no explanation of the composition of the stars or anything that they saw beyond. But humanly speaking, trees came and went, and grass came and went, and people came and went. Cloth, see, was new, and then it rotted, and they had no scientific explanation, but what they had was the broad common sense experience that everything does not remain as it is. See, they were trying to explain that. So the Ionians were the first, 5th century, by postulating, now notice what comes, one or more types. This is earth, air, fire, and water. Now, we all know, see, and that's not a laughing matter, but the Greeks, even including Plato and Aristotle, posited that everything in the world reduces to earth, air, fire, and water. Now, different philosophers said different things, but all of the things they said were equally unacceptable to an explanatory system. So they could have said an orangutan was the basic makeup, but there was no more reason for believing that than for believing this. But these elements were in their common experience. Earth, air, see, that's a Greek word, and gas, that's where we get geology. Fire, now they didn't know what was going on in fire. They didn't know that, had no explanation. We have to wait till the 17th and 18th century. They had fire long before they had explanation of fire. So it's true that you don't need to understand scientifically everything you do. We breathe before we know what the chemistry of oxidation is. See, it's a good thing. If everybody, you can't breathe till you pass the chemical equation for oxidation. Said, whoops, that's the end of that class. See? Now, what they were searching for is two things. They were searching for explanation. Explanation. They were conscious that the mind mind sought. Now, classical Greek thought said that all rational beings have a propensity to learn. That's a myth. But classical Greek thought said all rational beings had to search for explanation. Have you been to school recently? So explanation becomes a rational methodological matter, explanation. And they were searching for a universal explanation because at least the Greeks believed the universe was rational. The universe was rational. Now, I've said before that the Greeks, like the Near Eastern Shemites, did not have a view of creation. Now, fall semester we'll look at creation, but every philosophical mind that we have deals, Hermann deals, the Socratic or the pre-Socratic. That's in paperback, so if you don't have that book and you want to know the primary resources, pre-Socratic, Hermann Deal's work, that's about $60 in hardback or $20 in paperback. That's all extant materials from this period way back here before we start getting primary sources of Aristotle and Plato. So it's a very important tool for getting back here. But they have no so matter is not created. So the Greeks had no view of creation. They had a view of eternal creativity. That sounds like Hinduism. Well, what difference does that make? That seems so impractical as being relevant to any consideration. Well, that viewpoint will keep them from getting an explanatory power. What viewpoint will? That they had no explanation of the origin of the universe while they were searching for the rationality of the universe. Okay? So origin declaration. Now, we have no evidence of the origin of the universe. But when we come along to the 18th and 19th century, in a few weeks, they'll start extrapolating through light, extrapolating the distance and composition of the stars and things that I just intimated there. Well, notice that's not evidence. There is no direct evidence at all. It's all extrapolation based on certain assumptions that are testable within certain parameters, but it is assumed that the universe as a whole obtains. Well, that means if it is, the universe is reasonable. Now, notice those who deny God and deny creation in New Age and this kind of thing, it is in a probability calculus, in classical probability calculus, it approaches zero to assume that the origin of life in a randomized universe, the origin of life could only have started only on the Earth. In a universe bounded but quite large, it would be irrational to assume that life in any form is only an Earth characteristic. So on that assumption, you see, we still are searching with billions of scientific American taxpayers' dollars for intelligence in outer space. It's not just the science fiction and the cinemas and things. See, that you can take that with a glass of water. But see, they're searching at taxpayers' expense for intelligence on the basis of a cosmological model. There's not one mark that I've ever heard of or read, any evidence whatsoever that there's any intelligence any place in the universe except in the Earth. Now there may be, and I'm always open to evidence. And see, students will keep you honest. See, serious students will always keep people honest. They said, "Well, my uncle said he had 5 evidences of this." So then we'd have to check out your uncle, do a brain scan to see if that's just another standard uncle or what. Everybody has uncles, but some people have uncles. Now, the Ionians postulated those two, explanatory and universal. Now that breaks down because it never advanced anything. Now when we get the scientific revolution, it creates knowledge. You see, I try to give you a few clues each night. Knowledge that no one ever had before. They never possessed it and transmitted it. They deduced it from certain assumptions. So there is some incremental. See, we'd be operating even today with a revolutionary concept. Well, there is incremental knowledge, but all knowledge is not incremental. That's very important. Because if all knowledge is incremental, then evolution and empiricism would seem to be more legitimate than what I call critical realism. Okay? Now, those two things only. See, the Ionians. And here's how the Greeks talked. That everything in the world was composed of these building blocks, not the periodic chart. They had no weights. They had no atomic numbers, no weights, no explanation for why that was the case. But they just arbitrarily took these common sense experiences and posited them because clearly you could see some change taking place. See, the key word is change. Change. Common sense awareness of change. But science doesn't have its origin in common sense. That does in reads in common sense. What does in reads in common sense? The development of science. And the deeper into matter we get, the less commonsensical it is. Now we have to face that because pragmatism and the cultural relativists and pluralists, they just think everybody just has his own viewpoint. But see, science doesn't advance like that. Science advances because someone penetrates reality. And then that if it's a true penetration, then you can publicly explain that to other people. And then you could try it. See, it can't be a private matter. It can't. You feel it in your heart. So you can feel anything in your heart as long as you don't bother me with it. See? Now watch this. Here's where we get the origin of Greek metaphysical efforts to deal with the problem of change, about unity and diversity. You say that sounds like philosophy? Yes, up to the scientific revolution, all thinkers were philosophers, and all available knowledge in the culture were in the hands of the philosophers. And then, when Christianity came along, all available information was in the hands of the philosopher-theologian. Then when science came along, the scientists challenged the data of the philosopher-theologian. And culturally, there's a paradigmatic shift because the scientist has priority over the so-called speculative nonsense. Now, no metaphysician ever discussed how many angels. See how much distance or radius is an angel. There you go. Not very much. See, an immaterial object doesn't take up any space. So when you say, where is God? I say, no, not a church, but I would say to you, I say he isn't anywhere. And that's why the eisegesis of John 14 about mansions and things, it's just highly creative imagination. So he isn't any place. That's why heaven isn't a place. Because if it's a place, it's finite. If it's finite, and that's where God is finite. See on it? When God's finite, it's because he chooses to be someplace for my sake. He isn't by nature any place. Well, the theologians will ask, as I mentioned, just intimate just one or two little hermeneutical points. They begin asking, how can God be present in a world like this? Where is he? See, space? Is there empty space? Is God present in empty space? Well, we're not even there yet. See, and they'll start asking, where is God? Well, if there's nothing there, is God there too? Well, we want to keep away, now watch, creation versus pantheism, polytheism, panentheism. Notice what biblical theology of creation sets us against in the first place. Sets us against eternal matter, pantheism. God is not everything in the universe. Well, how come that's such a big item now? Because 200 years ago we lost the concept of creation. In the name of science, of course. So if you've got a God, he's kind of the boss of the high-speed computer. So he isn't a person, he's a principle. He's a mathematician. Well, that's a different thing than the biblical God. We've lost the whole reason for our being here. And suffering under these ungodly. See, I don't believe the Jews in Egypt suffered any more than we do being indicted, see, in this cornfield. This is, in excruciating anguish, except a cause. Causes will keep you going when nothing else will keep you going. Okay? Think about it. It might not keep you going, but I bet it would. Now, those two things only. Explanation, universality, these building blocks, and then they sought that how does the mind order get unity out of multiplicity? See, it sounds like rationalism and empiricism. We see multiplicity, but the mind's tendency is to reduce multiplicity to some univocal or some unifying principle. That happens in grammar. See, you couldn't have a section on nouns because the assumption is that all nouns comply with this behavior pattern. See, if each noun had its own behavior pattern, you certainly couldn't do what? Then you couldn't have a language class. And you would have to have a different word for, and this is what Leibniz was dealing with, see, about universal language. But if you're not careful, nominalism means you've got to have a word for every object in the universe because every object is different. Well, difference, see, but then univocity and difference. Okay. Now, those three things, multiplicity and unity, they were searching for how the mind can understand the world. But no one ever saw unity, did they? Anybody ever see unity? See, but without unity, there is no universality, and there is no rationality. And when there is no rationality, there is no explanation. Does that make any sense? See, if there's anything resembling what we think of when we talk about explaining something, there has to be some universality to the explanation. See, if every explanation is a private explanation, it's no explanation at all. So the Greeks were wrestling with that. Now, with a single, now they use this word in not English word, but stuff. They had no precise statement of what the building blocks of reality was. Well, by the time we get in scientific revolution, they get more and more specific to what it is. They'll get